I like to blow things up because I like to blow things up. Hello interwebs and welcome to May the 4th, officially Star Wars Day. I know it's no First Contact Day, there's no First Contact Day salmon to celebrate with, but it's still a wonderful day, and Disney has decided to grace us and celebrate this day with releasing the first episode of the new Star Wars animated series, Star Wars The Bad Batch. And I actually didn't know this first episode was cinematic length. Yes, just like the original Clone Wars series before it, the first episode of the show is basically a giant movie. Thankfully, this episode of The Bad Batch fares a lot better than the first episode of the Clone Wars show, which was, I saw that movie in theaters and that was a hot mess. But the show it spawned actually became probably my favorite Star Wars piece of media ever. It had its ups and downs, but when the Clone Wars was on fire, it was on fire. And the final arc of that show is easily one of my favorite Star Wars things ever. So I was so excited that Dave Filoni was going to return to that kind of era of Star Wars with his follow-up series, The Bad Batch. Kind of basically taking off right where that show ended and picking right up with these new clone troopers that are sort of a mixed batch of clone troopers who aren't necessarily the same types of regular stormtroopers. And we got a taste of them in that final season that came out about a year or so ago of the Clone Wars. And I kind of really like the characters there, but I did think that those episodes were kind of weaker compared to a lot of the rest of the Clone Wars. Not as bad as the Ahsoka episodes that in that final season. But I still thought that they were all strong characters in their own right, and I was excited to explore this era again with those characters. Because, again, the Clone Wars era is honestly my favorite era of any Star Wars series. When I was a kid, when I was playing Battlefront on the old PS2, I would always pick the Clone Wars era. None of that Galactic Empire BS. Come on, you play Kamino on the Clone Wars era, best map in Star Wars Battlefront 2, hands down, come at me. But enough about that. Let's talk about the actual show itself, The Bad Batch. What did I think of it? Well, like I said, and kind of alluded to earlier, I think this was a really great premiere for this show. It kind of got me really excited for what the show is going to be going forward, and it really felt like it was continuing off of the basis that the Clone Wars show was, but started to become its own thing. So it feels like it's sort of like a bridge between this and Rebels, I guess would probably be the next thing in the sort of Star Wars timeline. It really feels like we're really honing in on this sort of really early Empire era. And I am so excited to see it because this is probably one of the more interesting eras of Star Wars that has yet to be explored. Like I said, this feels like it's coming right off of the Clone Wars, and I love that the episode started off with the sort of newsreel presenter voice that we got in all of the old Clone Wars shows. It felt like it was just continuing right off. I'm like, oh, yes, this is what I'm here for. And the first scene that we got sort of reintroduced us to all of the Bad Batch clone characters. One of my main worries when I jumped into this show, when I was sort of hearing that was going to be a thing, was I wondered how they were going to differentiate each of these clones, because they are essentially 5 different clone characters. And while I liked them in that earlier Clone Wars episode, I didn't really have a big memory of each of them personality-wise. I just think they have their own thing. That one's a tech person, one's a shooty person, one's a big fighty person, and that's really about the only differentiation that I remembered about them. Remembered about them. I don't know where that accent came from. So I liked that this reintroduction sort of gave us a taste of what each of them are capability-wise, but also a little bit of a taste of their personality too. It was a very smart sort of introduction to all those characters. And I will say, throughout this entire episode, what I loved was that I was able to distinguish all of them pretty quickly. Again, I said my fear was I wasn't going to be able to differentiate them, and then they were going to kind of become a melange of characters, especially amidst the fact that they were going to be spending a lot of time with other clones. But I instantly remembered all of them. I remember Hunter, Wrecker, Echo, Tech, Crosshair, Omega, or Omega as she would say. All of them just instantly register in my mind right off the bat. Usually terrible with names, so it's a highlight of the show that it got me to remember all of them so quickly. The rest of this opening sequence was really good for setting up the new status quo here. We know we're right at the end of episode 3. Order 66 is put into place. All the Jedi are going to be killed. Also, did anyone else think the Caleb Padawan character voice was really old? He sounded really old. Sounded like an adult playing a kid. It was a very strange voice acting choice there. But the opening sequence set us up in this era and where we're at in the timeline, but also sort of set us up with where each of these clones are coming from. And sort of showing that, while there are regular clones, the Bad Batch are their own set of things, and they don't necessarily necessarily follow the rules of Order 66, and they have their own sort of morality, and they aren't necessarily as brainwashed as the rest of the clones are that we saw after the Clone Wars. One of the things that I also loved that started off here in this opening segment was that Crosshair, he actually believes like good soldiers follow orders, even though the rest of his comrades don't. And I like that sort of natural conflict that even though they weren't all programmed to follow Order 66 like the rest of the clone troopers, that they did have disagreements within them about what the Empire meant to each of them. And I'll actually be honest with you, I was a bit disappointed at the end of the episode where it was revealed that Crosshair was believing that way because because the programming of his chip was kind of still working. I actually liked it better if it would just have been Crosshair was just naturally more inclined to, want to be with the Empire, to actually think that being a soldier was a good thing. So I think it was kind of a cheap takeaway from his character to just say like, oh yeah, it was just programming. We can intensify it and make him even more evil at the end of the episode. So sort of make him our kind of main antagonist, probably going into at least the initial part of this series. A bit of a disappointment there because I actually thought his natural sort of resistance against the rest of his, batch teammates made a lot of sense and actually felt kind of nuanced in terms of their portrayal, that they are different people, but they have different opinions, even though they are clone troopers. I thought that was just a nice, natural thing that sort of took away from him in the end. Also, as we go back to Camino, and then we go back to Camino, and I liked seeing that the Bad Batch was not entirely comfortable with where things are, and we're sort of like feeling things out, but they weren't entirely like saying like, oh, I guess we'll just abandon everybody and sort of be out of here. Like, oh yeah, it's an empire. Like, they're concerned and worried and sort of noticing that things are different, but they weren't immediately like, oh, well, this is bad. I like that it felt a little bit more like they were soldiers kind of breaking out of like, this is the life that we've lived, and this doesn't feel right, but we're not immediately going to jump ship. And I like that this episode took us there. Instead of maybe being with like a Jedi character who would immediately be like, this is wrong, I need to go and fight. These characters took their time and like, we're like, yeah, maybe the Empire is pretty great. Speaking of which, Wrecker, by the way, is easily the standout of this entire crew. I love Wrecker. I can already tell Wrecker's going to be my favorite. I loved him, and I loved his banter with Tech. They were fantastic. I also liked the acknowledgement throughout the episode that they are all a little bit different in different ways in terms of where their backgrounds are as clones. Like Echo, for example, he was a reg, and so they acknowledged like he didn't follow Order 66 because his brain programming got erased, as we saw in the end of the Clone Wars. So I like that there was different explanations here. I also like the small little character reminders throughout this episode. Like, for example, Echo, when he was hooked up to machines in the medical bay, kind of had a PTSD sort of trauma flashback in that moment because of what we know happened to him back in the Clone Wars. So it was nice little reminders of these like character bits, even though Echo didn't get a ton of focus this episode, to remind us like, hey, this guy's been through some crap, and that's going to continue forward and be a part of his character. We're not going to forget that. I also like that there was some interesting philosophical stuff being brought up with Wrecker, of all people. Wrecker being like, like I sort of the joke that I did at the top, I blow things up because I blow things up, not because I was programmed to. But Tech sort of saying like, no, you were programmed to. Like, this is, your personality is what you were intended to be. And so that's such an interesting philosophical question. It's like, yes, they were programmed to be this way, so they are, their desires and interests are that way, but they're also just who they are, and so does it ultimately matter in the end? And also, they have their own free will, except for maybe Crosshair. Again, that's why I found his sort of stuff disappointing, because it kind of goes against this cool idea of free will and sort of their own choices in this sort of Clone Wars concept. I just like that sort of philosophical concept of like, are we made up of nature or nurture? Who are we? Do we have free will? That sort of is all inherent in this sort of Clone War and clone idea and programming and genetic stuff, like interesting stuff. Also, should be said, D. Bradley Baker, who voices all of the clone characters, fantastic job finding each individual like voices for these characters. He must be having a field day. His voice must hurt doing all these voices, but he does such a great, talented job of making each clone feel like a clone and yet different in their own ways too. So excellent stuff there. Also, we meet a brand new character, Omega, who is a young girl who we learn by the end of the episode is actually a clone. So we have a young female clone, which I'm not interested in for any gender reasons whatsoever. I thought Omega was actually a really interesting character. I like that she's brash, she's bold, she's forward. She has those same elements of like the sort of like, clone trooper character, but she's not the typical one. She's like a medical person as well. And also, like I said, a girl. And so I'm curious to see how they're going to take a girl clone trooper. Again, not necessarily for the gender reasons that I would obviously be interested in it, but I just sort of like that new interesting dynamic and new take on clones. I also love the subtle animation things that they added throughout the episode. Like, if you noticed, Omega copied Hunter a few times and was like doing the same motions that Hunter was doing, sometimes subconsciously, and sometimes it was played as if it was an actual choice. It wasn't necessarily something that was stated in the dialogue, but you can see that Omega kind of emulates Hunter in a lot of ways, and I like that that's sort of subtly hinting that they are kind of based off the same genetics, but also that Omega may look up to Hunter. And so that was just a small, subtle animation tick throughout the episode that I thought was really nice to see. And just shows the care that this team really puts into the show. It was also nice to see the return of Tarkin, sort of playing the main Imperial villain role that almost every single Star Wars show has to have in some senses. Like Rebels' big one was Grand Admiral Thrawn. This one, it looks like it's going to be Tarkin is going to be the main one. And that's nice. I like seeing him get a little bit more fleshed out. And it makes sense considering where he eventually goes, as we know with his character. It would make sense that he would be the one like, all right, how are we going to build this army? And his thing against clone troopers, as we saw back in the Clone Wars. So I like that sort of through line through his character here. And it was nice to see him pushing, being like, maybe this Bad Batch is good, but maybe they're not all loyal to us. And so the morally bad stuff that he's willing to do, like use live fire rounds against the clones during a training exercise and possibly get them killed, how much he does not care for them. He just sees them as fodder. But you kind of get that sense that that's his sort of idea of all people in the Empire a little bit. But then him testing the loyalty to go have them kill some, what he says are some separatists, but turns out that they are actually some rebels. And Saw Gerrera, of all people, shows back up here. Again, I love the voice actor who does Saw Gerrera in this. He kind of sort of does a cool middle ground between what Forrest Whitaker did in Rogue One with that sort of like weird stilted speech that he did, and then also how Saw Gerrera appeared back in Clone Wars. And so the voice actor found this nice little middle ground between the two where I really could kind of feel the line through there, because it wasn't really consistent with Forrest Whitaker did with Saw Gerrera in Rogue One. So I nice to see that there's like an evolution of his accent through this. That was kind of nice to see. And it was just good to see him pop up here and sort of the beginnings of him becoming a much more sort of antagonistic force to the Empire right at the beginnings of all of this. And he was the person to sort of push the Bad Batch into going further. I also do wonder a little bit if it does kind of create a little bit of a small universe syndrome with Star Wars. I think one of the problems that I'm seeing with this story and maybe with The Mandalorian as well is that while Star Wars is a big universe and there are numerous characters, the Bad Batch keep running into characters that we know. Like Saw Gerrera is not a big character, but it is weird in the entire galaxy he runs into Saw Gerrera of all people. It's not necessarily a bad criticism. I was excited to see Saw Gerrera. It makes sense for him to appear here, but I do wonder if there's that element of like small universe syndrome that comes into play. It's like, oh, the Bad Batch happens to run into a character that we know in this situation, but it makes sense, and I like the role that he played here, sort of pushing the Bad Batch into being like, no, you need to the Empire is awful, and you need to start realizing that now. If you have free will, if you really feel like you have free will here, you need to realize that and make your choice. And again, I liked seeing Crosshair push back against that, but I've already talked about him a little bit and my disappointment with where he eventually goes by the end of the episode, because I felt like you could have just done that naturally with his character as opposed to making it like programming stuff. And then we got the end sequence of the episode where they kind of escape. It was kind of set up for like the new status quo of the show going forward, but it looks like the Bad Batch is going to be going off, trying to fight the Empire, forming their own crew, and trying to figure things out on their own with Omega with them, and just her sort of being this new interesting dynamic with the entire crew. So in the end, I have to say, this was a great start to hopefully another great Star Wars show. I had a couple quibbles, most of it around Crosshair, but overall, this was wonderful, and a wonderful return to form for Star Wars animation. You know, after Star Wars Resistance, which I thought was okay, but I didn't really particularly love, it's nice to see that Star Wars animation is going back to like this sort of more darker, mature type of storytelling that I kind of personally like. Not that I'm against like brighter stuff that was Resistance, but I found Resistance to be kind of like blah in the long run, even though I kind of liked its flavor of Star Wars, but it just kind of ultimately didn't tell any interesting stories. And this seems like it's going to be doing something interesting in an interesting era of Star Wars. So I'm super excited to see where this goes, and I will be reviewing these week to week, so let me know what you think of them. And until next time, I hope that you... feels like saying live long and prosper on this. Feels like a bad move. May the sexy stay with you? We'll go with that. May the sexy stay with you.